Good morning. So I've referenced my family a number of times in the last couple of days. I'll probably say something today as well. And I was sharing with somebody this morning that my one sister, I have two younger sisters who are twins. I'm 7 years older than them, and I was really their mom until I left home when I was 16. And then we have two brothers, so the brothers are older than me, and the oldest one's 7 years older than me, so I'm precisely in the middle of my family. But one of my sisters and I are working on a book together. She's a therapist, and of course I'm a theologian and a general instigator of new things. And so we're working on a memoir together that's called Loving the Hell Out of Ourselves. And it's a story of healing. How do we come out of this life of chaos and violence and become healers in our vocations, and to become people who most days are pretty well. Some days not so much, but most days we're pretty well. And so we hope that book will come out next year. So just a little word for that. So this morning I want to talk to you about neighboring, the practice of neighboring, and what our neighbors need from us in this day and age in post-Christendom contexts. So this is the house where I lived when I was in my first pastoral appointment. It was in East Liverpool, Ohio, in the Ohio River Valley. Now, the Ohio River Valley used to be a bustling area with lots of industry. There were potteries, there were manufacturers, people could get good jobs and raise their families. And then the jobs were shipped overseas, and the factories closed, the potteries closed, and now poverty settled into the valley, all up and down the Ohio River Valley. So when I came on the scene as a brand spanking new pastor, fresh out of seminary, with my Master's of Divinity degree, which was miraculous. It's a wonder I ever graduated from high school when I left home when I was a junior, right? I was in grade 11. But here I was with my brand new master's degree, and I had really loved school. I really gave it my all and made good grades and graduated at the top of my class. And I went to live in this house, in this neighborhood, and it looked about like that at the time. So this was a tough neighborhood. It was a neighborhood with people who had generational poverty. There was a toxic waste incinerator that was right by the elementary school that pumped mysterious things into the air at night when people were asleep and it was dark. And there were chemical factories along in that city that put something into the air that made the paint fall off of the outside of the houses. So this is a neighborhood that I lived in. And there was a crack house right behind the house, right behind this house. You just went across the alley and there it was, an active crack house. And just a lot of struggles with the people in that neighborhood. So one day I was in the living room, and this, once upon a time when it was a bustling town, that was the doctor's house. So it had good bones. And the inside of it was beautiful. The woodwork was the beautiful hardwood window frames and so on. So I was in there and I was grieving that day. I was doing some healing work, and I was grieving about some events in my family, and I was by myself. I was crying really, really, like I was wailing. Did you ever weep and wail so hard that you thought you were going to be sick? It's so much pain that there are no words for it. Keening with grief. There I was doing that, which was necessary for me. I needed to do that. And all of a sudden, pound, 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 somebody's pounding on the front door of that house. And I just froze. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to go to the door. My face was swollen. My eyes were swollen. There was snot on my face. I mean, it was just a mess. But the pounding would not stop. It was pound, 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 pound. And finally, I had to go to the door so they'd stop pounding, whoever they were. So I go to the door, wiping my face off. I open the door, and here's the woman that lives in the crack house. She looks past my shoulder. She's peering into the house, and she says, "Honey, are you all right?" I was walking by and I heard you. Are you okay? She was ready to go in there and take on whoever was hurting me. She really was, this little skinny African-American woman who had had a terrible, terrible, painful life, living at the crack house, part of that whole scene. And she was coming to help me. That day began to change my theology. Because, when I moved into the neighborhood and I was a brand new pastor and I'd been to seminary and I had a master's degree and I was going to overcome my story and I was going to get away from my own story. You know what I'm saying? And here this woman shows up to help me, and I realized that Christ was coming to me in her. Because when I was in that living room wailing, feeling utterly God-forsaken, who does God send to me to bring this message of I see you, I hear you, I am there for you, but this woman from the crack house? I felt God-forsaken because of what I was experiencing. Did you know pastors sometimes feel God-forsaken? So that began to change my thinking, and I began to be troubled by scriptures like, whatever you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. This idea that God could come to us through somebody that doesn't claim to know God, that somebody whose life is pretty messy, that God could actually be in the neighborhood outside of the church building with people that aren't worshiping in a church building. That began to mess with me. So that was a neighborhood experience that began to move my theology out of this tight, confined place into a much broader vista. My neighbor was neighboring me when I had shown up to neighbor her. So this idea about God being in the neighborhood, and what is neighborhood theology, and what is it that our neighbors need, this all starts in the beginning of the Bible with 2 kids, a garden, and a lying snake, right? That story is our story, and I'm going to talk about this story in some ways you may never have thought about. So we all think we know this story. More of my fine artwork with my iPad and my finger. We might think we know this story. We've read it plenty of times. In the history of Western civilization, this story's been interpreted to us in some particular ways. And this story shows up in everything from plumbing ads to the Twilight novels. I'm not even going to ask you if you read Twilight. That story takes place not too far from here, by the way, in the Seattle area. But the story of forbidden fruit, the first man, the first woman, the first naming, the first everything. It's been interpreted in different ways, but in the Western church, coming through St. Augustine, this story's been interpreted to us in this one way that I want to describe, and maybe this is not how you interpret it, but I've heard this from pulpits over and over again, and I've read it in plenty of theology books. That God created the world and said it was good. God created a man and said he was good. And God created a woman, and that's when all the trouble started. That's what I've heard. I heard that she was out walking around in the garden, and this serpent shows up and tells her to eat the fruit, and she goes ahead and eats the fruit, and then she goes and takes it to Adam, who's over there somewhere, and seduces him into eating the fruit. He can't resist her because of her feminine wiles. I've actually heard this from pulpits. He can't resist her. She's so powerful, she's more powerful than God because of her feminine wiles. She is all that. And so he eats the fruit, and all hell breaks loose. And it's game over in Eden. And now they're in trouble. And have you heard this interpretation? I could say a whole lot more, but I won't. But I had been formed. I came to know Christ when I was 16 years old. It was around the same time that I left home. I came to know Christ, and he saved my life. The faith that I was formed in In the first several years of my Christian journey, this is what I was taught. And it kind of matched up with my family of origin about the roles of women and the roles of men and what women are for, and women are bodies and men are minds, and I mean, all kinds of stuff, right? But that's not actually what the Bible says. There's that troubling thing about reading what the text actually says. So what it says is that God did create the world, and God did it methodically. There's this beautiful pattern. Of course, we've got two creation accounts, right? There's the one where God speaks it, and then there's the one where God is like a potter with the clay down in the clay and rolls up God's sleeves and makes these people. And in these stories, the creation stories, God breathes life into animals and people, and they become living nephesh, living souls. The breath of God is in us. In the text, it says that. And in the text, it says that God created Adam and God created Eve. And in the account where God, it's just humanity, it says, and they were made in the image of God and they were good. Humanity was made in the image of God and it was good. In the other creation account, God takes one of Adam's ribs. This is a wonderful image. And creates Eve and breathes the life and so on. So she's made out of the same stuff as Adam. They're both made out of the same material. And so there's a wonderful egalitarian vision of Adam and Eve, man and woman, in the garden. And they're given responsibility and privilege to care for the garden. Now, God doesn't warn them to not talk to specific creatures, right? God says, don't eat from that particular tree, because the day you eat that fruit, you will die. Adam and Eve have no idea what die means, because they haven't died yet. Does this make sense to you? I want to look at this story in a little greater detail through some very particular lenses. St. Irenaeus is one of the great theologians of the early church. Do any of you remember him from seminary or your edifying post-seminary reading? St. Irenaeus, one of the great theologians of the early church. St. Irenaeus wrote a treatise on this story, and he saw Adam and Eve as being childlike. They were immature humans. They weren't fully grown or developed yet. In his treatise and in some of his other writings, St. Irenaeus made the claim that even if sin had never happened, even if the fall had never happened, Christ would have come anyway, because Christ was going to show us to maximum capacity what it means to be in the image of God as a human. That's interesting. So for St. Irenaeus, Adam and Eve were not willful sinners full of pride and wanting to defy God and that sort of. I'm exaggerating this only slightly. The Western translation, or the Western interpretation, that it wasn't like that. They were actually immature like children. So he imagined that when they were deceived by the serpent, it was actually the serpent who sinned against them, right? That this wasn't a willful act of pride and rebellion on their part. They were deceived by the serpent. So that's St. Irenaeus. If we just imagine some snapshots, St. Irenaeus' snapshot is over there in front of that beautiful thing right there. There's one snapshot. Well, there's another snapshot that I want to tell you about. One of the greatest English theologians in the world, the 14th century theologian and mystic, Julian of Norwich. In England, it would be pronounced Norwich. 14th century English woman. She grew up in a monastery. They took her to a convent when she was a little girl, in all likelihood. We don't know a whole lot about her background. We can surmise it from reading her one book that's in two versions, two lengths. But we think that when she was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, she was taken to a convent to grow up. This was a normal thing that happened with families in those days. And so she grew up. Well, when she was a little girl, around 4 years old, she loved Jesus very much. You know, children are very spiritual. They're more spiritual and more attuned than we think. We don't do them a good service when we trivialize them and marginalize them. Here's this little girl, and we don't know what her real name was either. She's named after the church, and I'll get to that in a minute. But she's praying to Jesus. She wants to suffer with Jesus because she's thinking about Jesus' sufferings. She loves him so much that she wants to suffer with him and for him. And so she prays that she might be able to bear some of his sufferings. Now, this is a really deep thing for a 4-year-old kid to pray. But even at that young age, she understood that when you love someone and they're suffering, you want to be with them. And you want to ease their pain somehow. She understood this. Well, nothing happened. She was disappointed. She went on her way. Then when she was 30 and a half years old, and she was living in the convent at that time, we're quite sure, she became deathly ill. She was lying on her deathbed. They called the priest to come and do the last rites. So the priest comes, and with the last rites, there's anointing with oil, and then the priest would hold a crucifix and offer the prayers of the tradition to help her die well. While this is going on, she had a series of 16 visions. She had visions of the Passion of Christ. All of them were of the Passion of Christ. And in these visions, they were very graphic. She saw the thorns penetrating his brow. She saw the blood drying up. She saw him becoming dehydrated. She saw his suffering. And it sounds really grim and horrible. It is grim and horrible. But what God showed to her and said to her as she watched these visions and asked God questions is so full of joy and hope and astonishing trust in God's intention to make all things new. So she has these visions. At the end of the visions, we don't know how much time elapsed, but she suddenly recovered from her deathbed illness. She just suddenly recovered. And it was miraculous. And so after that, she decided to become an anchorite or an anchoress, just kind of a professional intercessor for the rest of her life. And in that tradition, a little sort of cell-like apartment was attached to the church. This was St. Julian's Church, and she went to live in there for the rest of her life to pray for the world. She had a cat that stayed in there to keep the mice away. She would have taken in a bit of sewing and things like this for her livelihood. And there was a little window into the church. She could receive the Eucharist through the window. After she recovered from these visions, God spoke to her and said, not from the visions, from the illness, and had these visions. God spoke to her and said to ponder these visions for the rest of her life, to pay attention to every single detail because everything mattered. So not too long after she had this experience and she went to live in this little place and pray for the world, she wrote down what she had seen. The first version of it is called the short text. The whole book is called Showings, Revelations of God's Love. And so she did that, and then after many, many years of pondering it, she'd written down the short version, which, by the way, is the first book written by an English woman in the history of English women. Beautifully written, very rich theology. You can tell she was steeped in Scripture. You could tell she read the Church Fathers. She was a well-educated woman for a woman, and this is why we have quite a bit of clarity that she lived in this convent and had opportunities to learn and could read and so on. But much, much later, she wrote a longer text. It took her a long time to be able to write that one because there was a central vision that she had that became the interpretive key for all the other visions. And this central vision that she had connects directly to Irenaeus, the immaturity of Adam and Eve, and what God is up to in the neighborhood. So that central thing, that central vision was called the servant parable. Here's what she saw and why she saw it. She was watching these visions and asking God questions, and she noticed that none of these visions had to do with damnation. They weren't about hell, and they weren't about God being angry. And this surprised her. So she finally said to God, "Hey," I'm paraphrasing, "Hey, I don't get it. You're showing me all this stuff about your love and how you created everything and how your love sustains everything and your love always will. And you showed me the hazelnut and said, creation's like this hazelnut in my hand and it's good, and your love will always sustain us and that you have these good intentions. Why are you not telling me about hell? Church tells me about hell all the time. Why are you not showing that to me? What about our sin? And she starts to complain. What about sin? What about punishment? And so God does two things. God says to her, you worry about your own sin, not somebody else's. If you'll keep your focus on my love and my love for you and my love for the world, that sin will take care of itself. Don't worry about that. You focus on the love. So God says that to her. And then God gives her this vision of the servant parable. Here's what she saw. She saw the Lord in this vast, expansive place. And of course, she's coming in a culture where there are lords, right? And so the Lord, she says the Lord was comely. That means he was handsome. And he had dusky skin. And he was very comely and in this beautiful, expansive space. And then she saw that the Lord had a servant that he loved very much. The servant loved the Lord loved the servant, and the Lord asked the servant to go and do this task. And so the servant jumped up, eager to please, and ran off, and in his sort of childlike enthusiasm and joy to run off and go do something for the Lord, fell into a ravine, a deep ravine. Just fell down and was wounded in 7 different ways, which in the numerology of that day and that type of Christian theology meant in all the possible ways one could be wounded. He was just completely shattered when fell into the ravine on his way to do what God wanted. And the worst wound of all was in this ravine down here in the rocks. The servant could not see that the Lord saw him. He was completely alienated. He thought he was completely cut off. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, he was lonely, he was broken in all the possible ways one could be broken. But the worst wound of all was not feeling the presence of the Lord with him and thinking the Lord didn't know what happened to him. So in that place, the next thing that happens is the Lord comes and goes in and pulls the broken servant out of the ravine and heals him. He heals him so well that he's better off than he was before he was broken. He's a better servant than he ever was before he fell in the ravine. And so this is what God shows her. As she pondered this vision, it took her a long, long time of pondering this to figure out what it meant. But what she came to understand was this. That servant was both humanity and Christ. First Adam and second Adam, to use St. Paul's theology, right? The first Adam is Adam and Eve, the humans, Ha-Adam, who are created in the image of God. So corporate humanity, and Christ, the second Adam. This is, the Apostle Paul talks about this. And what she came to understand is that Christ loves us so much. Christ created us and loves us so much Christ can't bear to be away from us. We can understand this, right? We have children. I know I love my kids like that. If anything's hurting my kids, I have to go be there. She says that Christ loved us so much Christ can't bear to be away from us. So when in our falling, Christ falls with us. Christ goes with us in order to pull us up so that in his rising, we rise with him. And she has this incredible vision that God is making all things well. So Julian tells us that love is God's meaning. She said, in all of these years of pondering, she said, what is God's meaning? What is God's meaning? And the answer that kept coming back is, love is God's meaning. In her vision of the servant parable, the servant who represented corporate humanity was like an immature child. Does this make sense to you? When God put Adam and Eve in the garden in the story, just take the text at face value. God says, don't eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The day you eat that, you will die. Don't eat it. Everything else is there for you. God never says one word about the serpent. Did you ever wonder about that? See, now you're going to wonder. Never says anything about that. They're in a garden with this mystery of a serpent that's already there. And in the oral tradition, in the Hebrew faith, the oral tradition that then was written down later and became the written text, that's the way it happened, that wasn't an interesting question. Where did the serpent come from? That was not an interesting question. People understood, yeah, we're born into a world that's got lying snakes. That's the way it is. There's a sort of realism to it. So the question is not, why is there a serpent in the garden? Why is there this mystery of iniquity in the world? That's not really the interesting question for them in the ancient culture. The question is, what does God do about it? That's our question. We live in a world full of lying snakes. We do. I remember the day I was reading this story and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about the work that I do with people who are survivors of sexual abuse. I mentioned the statistics to you the other day that 1 out of every 3 girls and 1 out of every 5 boys has been sexually abused before adulthood, and usually it's a repeat offense, and usually the offender is somebody known to the child, either a relative or a neighbor, or an older child who's old enough to function as an adult in the little child's life. It could be the teacher, it could be the coach, it could be the pastor. It happens. And so this is not a small thing. Every person in this room is affected by this. Even if you and your immediate family have been fortunate enough to not be victimized, people that you love have. People on your church boards have. Your neighbors have. So I was thinking about this, and I suddenly had this revelation that if you take the story of Adam and Eve in the ways that I've just described to you, reading the actual text, with Adam and Eve as immature humans, and with the other insight that I've mentioned from these other theologians, and you put it, do you remember those old transparencies before we had PowerPoints? You had the machine and you put the clear things on it. You could put layers of the clear pages. Let's pretend it's one of those. So if you put the story from Genesis right there on the first one, and then you put the servant parable on top of that one, and you put Irenaeus' treatise on top of that one, and you put a template for child sexual abuse on top of that one, it's the same story. It's the same template. I remember the day I recognized this. It was revolutionary for me. Because I came to understand that that story is so much more than we thought it was. What happens in child sexual abuse, the way it functions in affecting a person's life and then how it spins out into adult life, is kind of archetypal for how any kind of original wound affects us. So what I'm going to say now, please hear me clearly. I am not saying that the story of Adam and Eve is only a story of sexual abuse. You understand this, right? Nod your heads if you understand my words. Because I don't want you to go on social media and say, we got this kook here and this is what she said. No. But I'm using the example of child sexual abuse to help us see, because it's a very clear way of describing this different way of thinking about sin, wounds, the healing of wounds, and what is possible for us in this world. So far, so good? Okay. So let's leap back to the story in the Bible again for just a minute. God doesn't warn them about the serpent. Adam and Eve are there together. If you actually read it in the Hebrew, it says that she gave the fruit to Adam who was with her. So Adam's hearing this whole thing, right? He's not over there somewhere and she's going to go sneak up on him and trick him into eating the fruit. That's not what it says. So here's the serpent saying to them, have some of this fruit. And they say, no, God told us not to, and so on. And I can just hear the serpent saying, but no, you will. If you'll just eat this fruit, you'll be like God. And in telling them they'll be like God and in sort of persuading them and talking to them in this way, just think of them like half-grown kids, right? And they're listening. They don't know to be afraid of the serpent. They don't know. Nothing's ever tried to trick them before. They are vulnerable. Children are vulnerable. To be vulnerable, that word literally means capable of being wounded. They are vulnerable. And if you've ever been deceived, you know that when you're deceived, you really thought something was true, it was presented as true, but it wasn't true. You were tricked, right? Like that time you bought the car, the used car, and you thought it was going to be just what you needed when you were in high school, and it turned out to be the worst lemon ever. Or that time you believed your partner that they were just working late until you found out they weren't. Yeah. Satan, Satan, we've come to identify Satan with the serpent, but let's just stay with serpent for now. If you have theological problems with that, just stay with what it says. The serpent talks to them, persuades them, to use the language that we use with children in abuse, grooms them. And says, no, you'll be like God. And so here are these vulnerable people that want to be like God. God is like a parent to them, comes and walks with them in the cool of the evening. And of course they want to be like God, who's like a parent to them. That's what children do. They want to be like the adults. That's all of the children's play activity has to do with learning how to be an adult someday. And so they think about it, and God is wise, and they want to be wise. And so they take the fruit. And once they take the fruit, everything changes. They could not have any idea what die means because they hadn't died yet. To know, remember? To know in the Hebrew, ancient Hebrew way of thinking, to know something is to participate in it. It's not a head trip, it's a life trip. Even when it says, and then Adam knew his wife Eve and she conceived, I assure you that was a holistic experience, right? That word know is used euphemistically to mean participate. And so we know something by participation. And so they participated in the fruit and they began to die. It's something they could not have imagined before because they hadn't done it before. So the very first thing they do is to go off. They're now alienated from each other, from themselves, from God, from creation. They're afraid of the serpent. They don't know what to do. The very first thing they do is they go to the fig tree. Anybody have fig trees in here? We have fig trees on our farm. Fig leaves are like stinging nettles or cow parsley or some of these other plants that if you put them on your skin, they cause a rash and blisters, and they itch and sting. They're like that. And so Adam and Eve, who were naked and unashamed before, they were just who they were. They were not trying to impress anybody. They were just who they were, at home with themselves. Now they take fig leaves and they press it against the most vulnerable part of their bodies, their sexuality. And that's the way God finds them when God comes in the evening. Now, what does God do when God finds them in the garden? Does God shout at them? Does God shame them? Does God blame them? Does God smite them? I always imagine God's voice when God is calling for them at the first part of that where God comes to the garden. I always imagine God's voice being something like my voice when I was in the grocery store and my daughter wasn't paying attention. She was 3 years old and she got on the grocery cart of somebody else and went off that way. And I turned around from the pork chop section or wherever I was and she wasn't there. And I immediately panicked and like, where are you? And I had to drop everything until I found her, and she was over there on the end of somebody else's shopping cart, just kind of distracted. I think God's voice was like that. My beloved, where are you? And so God talks to them and says it's going to be hard now, and says how it's going to be hard. And God sees these punishing, self-inflicted wounds of fig leaves and says, let me take those away, and gives them soft clothing. God gives them a plan for what to do next so they can survive. God is there for them. And God promises the woman that salvation will come in time. And the serpent's head will be struck, right? That's what it says. So for Adam and Eve, who are deceived by the serpent, and then they're wounded because they believe what the serpent says, this is their original wound. And out of the original wound, these consequences begin to happen. Does this make sense to you? I don't care what Augustine said about pride. I've read all that stuff, but it doesn't jive with the actual text or with what I observe about all of us as human beings. We're born into this world as blameless little babies with no teeth. We're born into a world with lying snakes. Andrew Sung Park is a Korean theologian who's, I think, still at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio, and has done a lot of work. These are some books that I recommend to you if you'd like to read more about this. And these books are theologically rich, but also accessible for lay people. So he looks at this Korean concept of Han, which is an idea that is when we're harmed by life, whether the harm is intentionally inflicted by bullying, let's say, on an individual, or we're harmed because our parents got divorced, or we're harmed because we belong to a particular population, like we're Koreans and the Chinese are at war with us, or we're harmed because we're African Americans and come from a slave background. You see what I'm saying? That if we're harmed by life, whether it's intentionally or we're harmed because whether it's intentional against us as individuals or as a people group, or even if we're harmed by disasters, a tornado, a mudslide, a tsunami, the harm that happens to us leaves residue. And that residue, the sort of after effects of being harmed, is called Han, H-A-N. This is a philosophical concept, a Korean philosophical concept. So Andrew Park has taken this concept to talk about how God looks at us, human beings, always first and foremost as those sinned against rather than those sinners. In other words, God doesn't start with our guilt, God starts with our being born into a world where we're inevitably going to be harmed. Does this make sense to you? So we're born into the world where inevitably we're going to be harmed. We're going to suffer hurt. We're going to be sinned against. And so he talks about how Han is the after effect. And out of the Han, we develop coping mechanisms, self-protective barriers, ways of thinking and acting so we can get by. This is inevitable. And that is where we start acting out against other people out of our own life experiences and out of our self-protective impulses. True and false self, Basil Pennington and others have written about that. So God looks at us as the sinned against before God ever looks at us as sinners. And this makes all the difference in the world. This is also deeply consistent with Julian of Norwich's theology. It's consistent with St. Irenaeus' theology. I just want to trace this for you, that this goes back to antiquity. This is not some new idea that just popped up in postmodern times. There's a long theological tradition that looks at what happens in that story and how it happens now. So, in Julian's theology, in Showings, she says that when God sees us in our brokenness, in our sin, in our residue from being sinned against, God looks at us with pity and not with blame. That's how she sees it. God looks at us, it's not that we are no longer responsible for ourselves or no longer accountable to God, but God looks at us first and foremost with compassion. God sees the whole story and loves us in the whole story. So how does this work in an actual person's life? So let's take this little Susie, okay? Her name will be Susie. Because as people who care about neighboring well, as people who want to faithfully bear witness to Jesus' love in this world, in post-Christendom contexts, how in the world can we parse out the difference between a person's sin, whether they're in or out, and a person's han, what's happened to them and how it's affected them, and a person's guilt, a person's shame, a person's story? We don't know all that stuff, do we? We don't even know our own stuff. Jeremiah says our hearts are desperately wicked and we deceive ourselves. We don't know all that stuff. How do we parse these things out? So how do we approach these things when we can't clearly say you're in, you're out, it's this or that, and this sort of dualistic thinking? Well, let's say that Susie is born, see where it says sin, where with a little curl right there. Susie's born into a family where there's a lying snake. She's born into a family like that. She's born into a family where, we'll take the example of an addiction. She's born into an addicted family where one of her parents or maybe both of her parents are addicted to substances. Maybe her parent is an alcoholic. She's born into that family. She's a beautiful baby. All babies are beautiful. It wasn't her choice to be born. She just came into the world. And already she's in a family where there's an addiction. It's a shame-based family where the addiction is the central thing. And people tiptoe around on eggshells and keep family secrets, and you don't tell people why he didn't show up at work. You make excuses and so on. And she's born into that family, and while she's still a baby before her teeth have all come in yet, while she's just learning how to walk and she's just exploring the world the way toddlers do, she's already being sinned against. She's being sinned against because she too has to learn to walk on eggshells. She can't have normal needs. She learns very early on that she cannot have needs. She cannot express needs because her needs don't count. Because it's the other need that counts in her family, and nobody ever talks about it, but that's the way it is. She also suffers neglect, and she suffers abuse, and she suffers all these other things that are related to this addiction. So while she's just a little one, she's wounded in these ways. She's not wounded because she made a willful choice to be proud and defy somebody. She experiences these things because she's born into that world. And so by the time she's in first grade, second grade, she already carries quite a bit of han, residue from being sinned against. She's already learned to scan the horizon all the time to see where the next blow is coming. She's already learning she's got to adjust herself to whoever she's with so that she can get by. Her boundaries are already being violated in significant ways. So she's already learning that intimacy is not possible. Intimacy where we gladly give ourselves to one another and it's a mutual relationship of trust and friendship and love and so on. She's already learning that. So Susie carries this han, and out of her han, she might go in a number of different directions. So for example, she might go down the direction where by the time she's an adolescent, she's cutting herself. She's already using a lot of drugs. She's already had some abortions. She already has sexually transmitted diseases. She's already in trouble with the law, and she's just in grade 8. It's coming out of this trajectory. And in all of those experiences, she's hurting herself and hurting other people. And sin is happening, right? Sin is happening. So she might go down that road of self-destruction. She might go another way, because children growing up in these families can go in different ways. She might grow up and decide early on out of this han and out of these experiences that she's going to be a superstar. She's not going to let anybody see what she's really like on the inside. And so she achieves all kinds of wonderful goals and becomes very perfectionistic and is very hard on herself. There's constant critical chatter inside her head telling her she's not good enough, and if they only knew, and so on. And so that chatter comes out of her mouth toward other people when she serves on a committee at church. It comes out of her mouth toward her family, toward her neighbors, and she's that person. But both of those trajectories, and I could give you several more, they're all coming out of the shame, the sense of being permanently stained. That's where that comes from. And so by the time Susie's an adult, this false self has formed. Her coping mechanism, whether it's the superstar perfectionist or it's this other pathway or some other pathways in between there. And that's her life. So my question for you is, how is Susie ever going to know real salvation? Salve. The root word for salvation is salve, S-A-L-V-E. It's the same word we have for salve, what you put on your sore to make it better. Your sore muscles, your sore skin, salve. That word salvation means that which makes us well again. How is she going to experience that? Now, when we think about it, someone with an extreme case of what Susie's gone through, we might think this is a hopeless lost cause. This is not possible. Nobody could be saved from that. We need to have cleaned up people in our church that are a little easier to deal with. And it would be easier to deal with, except that that's not who our people are. That's not who we are. If we were all honest in this room, we all have our issues. We all have our stuff. And we also have the story of the Gerasene demoniac in Mark, the man who was full of the legion of spirits. Do you remember this story? I mentioned it on the first day I was here, I think. Susie's full of toxic shame. People who've grown up with violence against them have toxic shame. And toxic shame is not the sense that I made a mistake or I need to change direction. It's that I am a mistake. I will never fit in. I'll always be on the outside looking in. I don't have a place at the table. And when those waves of toxic shame are triggered, there's a profound need to escape, to hide, to get away. Toxic shame is behind so many addictions and self-destructive impulses, including suicide. Toxic shame. The sense that I don't even deserve to be alive. Well, in this picture, this is an artist's rendering of that man who was so full of self-destructive impulses and living among the dead in the tombs, and the townspeople were terrified of him. Everybody was terrified. He was terrified of himself. And then Jesus, in this just got the weirdest story in the New Testament. The spirits go into the pigs and off they go off the cliff and everybody gets mad. And the man is sitting at Jesus' feet, sane for the first time in his life. And Jesus sends him back to his own people. This image is what it feels like to have waves of toxic shame. I was showing this picture to a group with theology, medicine, and culture, and there was a doctor there in the audience, and he came up to me afterward and he said, I was thinking about that man and how he's full of toxic shame and how he is all curved in upon himself. He said, but there's another dimension to this image that for me as a doctor, and that is it looks exactly like a child that's crowning when a child is being born. It looks just like that. And so we began to talk about how that man was being born again as Jesus delivered him from this toxic shame. New life is possible. How do we help Susie, our neighbor Susie, find salvation? How do we help ourselves find salvation when we're the ones that are bound by the shame and the memories and the everything? Now, I've been teaching for a long time, and whenever I begin to talk like this, people get troubled. Like, wait, what about responsibility? People need to go to hell. People need to burn. Like, no. No, if you've ever been burned on purpose, you know that should not be something anybody ever does to anybody. That's not the love of God. So what about responsibility? Isn't Susie responsible for her bad choices? Shouldn't we blame and punish Susie for getting those abortions and for cutting herself? And shouldn't we permanently stigmatize her and not allow her to serve communion or be a pastor? And should we, you know what I'm saying? Let's shame the hell out of her. Let's shame her and reject her, and finally she'll be cleansed. Do you think that's going to work? Y'all are really polite. It's not going to work, I'm telling you. Shaming and damning people is not going to heal anything. It's not. So what about responsibility? Is Susie responsible? There's all this compassionate stuff which sounds like a bleeding heart liberal. Isn't that just a bunch of hogwash? Well, that word responsible means able to respond. Able to respond. Han interrupts our capacity for clear reasoning about how to respond. Did you know this? Trauma affects our ability to be present and able to respond. When we carry trauma in our bodies, in our minds, in our spirits, and trauma is carried in all three, we literally can't fully be present. We're living out of the trauma. And so, for people, for example, who are victims of domestic violence, partner violence, intimate violence, however you'd like to label it, the more a person experiences partner violence, the less capable they are of making wise moral choices, because part of the violence is brainwashing. That's the way it works. This is why all of you pastors out there, you've had someone sit in your office and say, and with a black eye or a broken bone, or maybe that you didn't see the bruises, but the horrible things they've experienced that they're telling you about, and you're saying, well, why don't you just leave him? Why don't you just leave her? You don't have to stay in that. They've broken the covenant with their violence. And that person says to you, but I have to stay. I have to, or he or she will take the children or something. And so the capacity to think clearly and to know how to make a wise moral choice is damaged by the abuse. So whether it's in that situation or it's Susie who grew up with these wounds, and by the way, Susie's much more likely to get into a violent relationship as an adult. You know why, right? Because they're living out of that's normal. That's just the way it is. That's familiar. Salvation for Susie is about coming into a community where she belongs, where she's welcomed. She gets to belong, even while she is a hot mess. Gets to belong and gets to observe and gets to watch how people are and be with the people. And gradually reclaim moral agency. Gradually reclaim it. And responsibility means gradually being more and more able to respond with wisdom and a good choice. This is a process. It does not happen overnight. In our Wesleyan tradition that I'm a part of, we talk a lot about sanctification, being made holy. And for me, this process of sanctification and the process to get better and better at making wise choices, these things are together in real life. Salvation for Susie is going to take a whole village of people, a community. She will never know deep salvation without a community who loves her well, who don't let her get away with dumb stuff, but are absolutely there for her. This is what God's mission is. This is the mission of God, shalom for this world, the making of all things new. The new creation. This is God's intent. This is God's promise. This is what God is up to with chesed, to make all things new. All things, not just a few things, not just a little tiny group of beleaguered people who've been marginal. No, all things. This is what the Bible teaches us. And so God is all about the healing of original wounds, the forgiveness of sin, the transformation of Han into compassion and wisdom, liberation from bondage so we don't keep making the same dumb choices over and over again like a bunch of robots programmed to do the wrong thing. participation with God in what God is doing in the world. We get to be a part of what God is doing in the world of making all things new. And what happens as we experience deeper and deeper levels of salvation, especially those of us who come from a background of trauma? What happens is we find ourselves moving away from having that false self and keeping the guard up and always being, having to scan the horizon and always being hypervigilant and making the same dumb choices. We move away from that and we move more and more and more toward being ourselves, the self that God dreamed. And we find ourselves at last naked and unashamed. We are who we are. We have compassion for ourselves with God's compassion. And because of that, we have compassion for our neighbors with God's compassion. If we have a little community of Christians, even 5 or 6, who live this way, who love this way, it's a dynamo that will change the world. You don't have to have a big congregation. You have to have a congregation that loves like this. It will change your city. It will change your rural environment. It will change everything. So this is for your reflection. What are the implications for how we see and relate to our actual neighbors where we live and work? How might this way of looking at life change how we are with our neighbors, how we understand and practice evangelism, and how the church is present in our neighborhood? Thank you.